analysts have been warning of the dollar's impending doom.
I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I think I will use the word doomed in the long term.
The US dollar is the most powerful currency that exists today. It's accepted and traded almost everywhere in the world and has shown strong resilience through numerous financial shocks and mounting fiscal debt.
The US dollar for the last couple of decades has been the preeminent global currency in virtually every dimension you can think of.
It allows us to have a great demand for our currency and for our bonds. So it often allows us to live a bit beyond our means, so we can borrow easily and at low interest rates in the world to finance economic growth.
But some experts worry that the dollar's dominance may be under threat.
We tend to think that nothing could ever dislodge the dollar from this preeminent status as the world's currency. That view is overblown and ultimately will be challenged.
So what poses a threat to the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, and just how long can its dominance last?
Okay, so in part A of this video, we went over how the dollar became king. If you have not watched that video, please stop this video. You missed an important video that sets up the whole stage for this one. This is a continuation of part A. So from part A, we know how the dollar became king. But at the point in time we are at in the world, we are at the time when the king is about to be dethroned. I mean, do you know that gold has reached new record highs just recently? Do you see what has happened with the price of Bitcoin? The world media is not making a big fuss of it. But there is definitely a movement and a shift happening, and the majority are completely unaware of it. I believe right now a big part of the agenda is happening right in our faces as they have us distracted and focused on Israel beginning their war in Gaza again. But President Putin of Russia, who rarely has left Russia since the war in Ukraine, he has made a trip to Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest pieces to the dominance of the dollar.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is here in Abu Dhabi, where he is holding talks with UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. It's been fairly rare for Mr. Putin to travel outside of Russia since his invasion of Ukraine almost 2 years ago. But he received a warm welcome here a short time ago with the UAE military jet flyover past his limousine route and a full military salute. For more on this, so what more, though, do we know about Mr. Putin's visit to the UAE and the wider region? And what is he trying to achieve?
Well, I think it's several things, Becky, and I think that this visit, as we've just seen there on that video that you were just playing, is extremely important to the UAE and, of course, later to Saudi Arabia, but very important to Vladimir Putin as well. And I think some of the images that we've seen, especially with that flyover, with that salute, but also with the escort that Vladimir Putin got, I think it is showing how important this visit is also to the UAE and the message that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are trying to send to the United States and also to the rest of the world, saying that, look, they are America's allies. They're very important allies for the United States in the Middle East, but they also want to continue working and having pragmatic relations with the Russian Federation and with Vladimir Putin. I did see some of the opening remarks in that meeting with the UAE president, where the UAE president himself said that the UAE is Russia's most important trading partner in the Middle East. Vladimir Putin, as you've noted, himself then saying that the relations between the UAE and Russia are at an all-time high. Now,
and also, if you don't remember, China's President Xi did the same exact thing. Actually, it's exactly like a year ago. They did this at the same exact time. But understanding like that, that's not for the media to tell you. That's for you who are awake to see for yourself. Do you see the welcome he was given? They're showing real respect. And the crazy part is that the media has kept us pretty much in the dark of all of this. I mean, the Republican debate the other night, they didn't mention this once, but yet they kept talking about war this and war that. All this because they want us asleep to their agenda, not ready for it when it comes together. They want you to know that war is coming. They just don't want you to know what you should be prepared for. So in order to really understand the agenda, it's important to understand how we got here, and we cannot do that while ignoring the history. In part A, we discussed how the dollar took the throne in the world, but we have not discussed how it got to the position where it is now being challenged. In order to go over the history of our mind control, we must understand this agenda in full, because it is an all-important backdrop to the world that we currently live in. You cannot understand the world today if you do not understand this topic. I assure you that those that do not understand what is happening in the world currently do not understand what I'm about to discuss. At the end of the video, you'll understand why. Let's keep going. As I explained in the last video, there have always been powerful men who have been the real power brokers controlling the world. But for the general public, they know nothing of them. This is a part of the mind control, which is why we're discussing it in this mind control series. The public has a very false view and understanding of power. And many people allude to it and try to expose it, but they do it in a very fake way. This is how Donald Trump came to power in the eyes of the ignorant, because they use words like deep state. That annoying presidential candidate, he even tried to use that in the debate the other night. He actually says who we think are running the world are not really running the world. But then he goes into a fake description of the power.
Here's the dirty little secret in American politics today. The people who we elect to run the government are not the ones who are even actually running the government. It is the bureaucrats in those three-letter agencies that are writing regulations that Congress never gave them the authority to write. And the good news is, a U.S. president can absolutely fix that.
It's all a form of mind control, trying to grab the trust of a segment of the population who knows there's something wrong, but does not truly understand what that something is. I'm trying to display it to you. The general public, most people that you know, believe this is where the power lies. But you now know that there is more power behind the scenes, and so the mind control should be breaking with you. But now that you understand a little bit more about the hidden power behind the scenes, let's go back in time and understand how we got into the mental programming that we're in today. Let's go back to the 70s and see what the mind control public saw when they saw power. And again, that answer is simple. They saw him. Richard Nixon. In 1969, Richard Nixon was sworn in as President of the United States. He took over the war in Vietnam, and they had a draft.
With the war in Vietnam as a backdrop and the futures of some 850,000 young men on the line, the lottery featured a bin containing 366 capsules, one for each possible birthday. The order in which their birthdays were drawn from that bin would determine the order in which those young men would be drafted. First chosen, first to serve.
You see, Nixon was the public face to the agenda of the power brokers' conspiracy. You should understand a little bit of his politics and what was said about him. In David Rockefeller's memoir, he writes on page 272 and 273, Nixon was a strong supporter of Israel, and during the 1968 presidential campaign, he had insisted that the balance of power in the Middle East must be tipped in Israel's favor, and pledged to support a policy that would give Israel a technological military margin to more than offset her hostile neighbors' numerical superiority. Once in office, Nixon and Kissinger began to formulate the concepts that would be used to reshape the role of America in the world. Detente with the Soviet Union, the opening of China, and the Nixon Doctrine, which called for smaller powers to carry the burden of defense against communist expansion and subversion in their own regions. David said, both men were realists and committed to an objective, almost ruthless appraisal of American objectives and the means to achieve them. Yeah, that's Richard Nixon. Know this. Richard Nixon was a president wrapped in scandal only to keep the masses distracted from the overall agendas he ushered in. He brought about massive changes in the world under his banner. Agendas like using Israel to bring a balance of power in the Middle East, the beginning of the Cold War dealing with strained relations of the Soviet Union, also with the opening of China. You see two new powers that the international bankers created after World War II. Nixon and Henry Kissinger were the face of the doctrine that looked to reshape the world, as David Rockefeller has said. Well, to be clear, he didn't really say the face of it, because that would require him to admit that he was one of the puppeteers. But Nixon, as well as Kissinger, were the face of the agenda. And so in the beginning of the 1970s, while everyone was being influenced by all the new changes that had come from the 60s, particularly the biggest influence being the television, as we spoke so much about, Americans were focused on what the television told them to focus on, which was a bunch of movements and the war. This is how the hippie movement grew, all from dealing with the stresses of this war that literally had nothing to do with them. They spoke about spreading democracy and freedom, but this public being led by the media grew anti-war sentiment. And this is because they were told to have this sentiment.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
The thing you want to understand is that what was really happening, the public really didn't know or understand. The escalating costs from both the Vietnam War and domestic social programs resulted in increasing amounts of United States dollars being printed. In the early 70s, the United States as a whole began running a trade deficit for the first time in the 20th century. Foreign owners of United States dollars began to question the ability of the United States government to reduce budget and trade deficits. Also, foreign nations, in particular the French, began to redeem their dollars for gold, as legally entitled under the Bretton Woods Agreement signed in 1944. It's said that the drain on the United States gold threatened to completely empty the United States Treasury. That's what they say. And so to prevent this from happening, on August 15, 1971, remember this, President Richard Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window. He made the dollar inconvertible to gold directly, except on the open market.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. Now, what is this action, which is very technical, what does it mean for you? Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you want to buy a foreign car or take a trip abroad, market conditions may cause your dollar to buy slightly less. But if you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar.
And this move cut and removed the last link between gold and paper money. They couldn't just give $35 and get an ounce of gold. No longer. It was in 1971 that fiat money was created. Money that was backed by nothing. This was the start of the major conspiracy that we know today. This was the plan all along, and it took 15 years to make it happen. They got the world all attached to the system by promising to be good partners, but later they reneged and said those dollars that the rest of the world owned no longer could buy gold at that $35 mark that the Bretton Woods Agreement originally set. The result was inevitable, with gold soaring from $35 to $195 an ounce by the end of 1974. This was the final step in abandoning the gold standard. All the central banks had to control now was the public's perception of inflation to allow them to create as much money as they desired. It was known as the Nixon shock, but the effects, they weren't really felt just yet. Shortly after Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard on September 28, 1971, he was done. He signed the enabling legislation to basically end the draft, though it did not formally end until 1973. In 1972, Nixon was at the top of his game. He desegregated all Southern schools. He ended the draft. He created the EPA and the Cancer Institute. He even went to China, bringing China on the world stage. He was extremely well liked by the American public, and that was an election year in 1972. In that election, it was one of the greatest victories any president ever had. He carried every state except Massachusetts and D.C. But in 1972, they also began to introduce the Watergate scandal.
5 men were arrested early Saturday while trying to install eavesdropping equipment at the Democratic National Committee. And it turns out that one of them has an office in the headquarters of the Committee for the Re-election of the President.
But at the time of the election, with all his victories, the American public, they didn't want to believe he had anything to do with it. And this disbelief was mainly because the media didn't really allow them to think it yet. But the power brokers decided to experiment with their control through the media, and they started reporting more on Watergate, and more things became revealed. And in 1973, the country that loved Nixon began to hate him. You have to watch this mind control. The American public were very clearly controlled by the media, and the power brokers, they knew it. I mean, they loved him in 1972. But they created a scandal, then the vice president, Spiro Theodore Agnew, steps down, the country becomes divided, and then they start impeachment hearings on Nixon. By August 8th, 1974, Nixon had resigned, and this was the whole talk about his presidency. This was his legacy.
But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
But as you go back and listen to all this is what is missing from the mainstream analysis. You see, Nixon was the public face to the agenda of the power brokers' conspiracy, more than anyone else who ever pushed it into the mainstream before him. But because the public was so controlled by the media, they only knew to focus on what the media told them to focus on. We're very much like that still to this day. Nixon was the face of the actions and moves of international bankers, probably more so than any president in his time. This was the international bankers. This is what they were doing. He was the face. They were doing many things behind the scenes, and as they developed policies, he was the face of them. He was used to change the international standing in the world with the United States, and by the time he left office, the United States was now in shambles. But the public really didn't know what to blame it on besides the war.
People who want to work but can't find jobs are part of today's other bad economic news. The unemployment rate soared to 8.2% nationwide last month, and it rose to an even higher figure here in California. A statewide jobless rate of 9.3% has jammed local unemployment offices. In terms of people, some 920,000 Californians are now out of work. Locally, the unemployment rate has risen to 8.9% in the Los Angeles Long Beach area. And in the lines today, few people were expressing any optimism about quick economic recovery.
So after the scandal of Nixon was successful, they transitioned into their next phase. And that's when we see the next president, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford became president, and he nominated who?
He comes through the door now with his choice. And the choice, it is Nelson Rockefeller, the former governor of New York, who was leading the list of speculation among many people. A man who is 66 years old, one of the best-known names in America, politically and otherwise, and certainly an international figure in his own right.
After a great deal of soul-searching, after considering the advice of members of the Congress, Republicans, as well as the Democratic leadership, after consulting with many people within the Republican Party and without, I have made a decision which I would now like to announce to the American people. But the man that I am selecting as nominee for Vice President is a person whose long record of accomplishment in the government and outside is well known. He served in the Department of State under former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He served under the presidency of Harry Truman. He served in the Department of HEW under President Eisenhower. He has served as governor of the great Empire State, the state of New York, for 15 years, the longest period of time in the history of the state of New York. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you a good partner for me, and I think a good partner for our country and the world. So I now announce officially that I will send the name of Nelson Rockefeller to the Congress of the United States for confirmation. Nelson?
As you pointed out in your moving message to the Congress, these are very serious times. And at times, as you pointed out, that require the closest cooperation between the Congress of the United States and the executive branch of government. They also require the dedication of every American to our common national interest. You, Mr. President, through your dedication and your openness, have already reawakened faith and hope. And under your leadership, we as a people and we as a nation have the will, the determination, and the capability to overcome the hard realities of our times. I'm optimistic about the long-term future. Thank you, sir.
Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. These men were not elected, they were selected and put into power. So Ford, he comes into office and he basically concludes the Watergate scandal, telling the mind control public that they just need to move on.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule. But there is a higher power. By whatever name, we honor him, who ordains not only righteousness but love, not only justice but mercy. As we bind up the internal wounds of Watergate, more painful and more poisonous than those of foreign wars, let us restore the golden rule to our political process, and let brotherly love purge our hearts of suspicion and of hate. In the beginning, I asked you to pray for me. Before closing, I ask again your prayers for Richard Nixon and for his family. May our former president, who brought peace to millions, find it for himself.
This change in the presidency was purely a deceptive mind trick that was about removing Nixon from the minds of the public and moving on to the agendas at hand. You see, if Nixon had remained president and then the problems that were about to occur started and gained steam, the American public would have been able to put a face and look at the direct actions of why their troubles had started. But you see, once they changed the CEO of the country, then people were able to be redirected into the future and not know what happened in the past. And this is exactly what happened. The events with Richard Nixon seem to be the most mind-controlling events of the 70s. They loved him, then they hated him, all by the power of the media. I am positive that the powers that be knew by this time that their mind-controlling campaign was strong and successful. Today, when you talk about Richard Nixon, the first thing that people talk about is Watergate and his impeachment. But they don't really recognize exactly what this man did. The narrative surrounding him is completely one-sided. He was a champion in the face of massive change during the heights of his popularity, and then, after his purpose was fulfilled, they removed him by making some ridiculous scandal. You see, what was about to happen next? In the 70s, it was severe. But this is also why it seems that nobody's able to pinpoint why. You see, to this day, when I talk to many people, they are still unaware that the dollar is not backed by anything. Or if they are coming to this understanding, they're understanding this now. Many today, particularly the older generation, they still have believed that it was backed by gold. This is obviously not all, but I've come across many. And even many that know that it's not backed by gold, they came into this understanding recently. Many of them not from back in that time. What that tells me is that when Nixon removed the dollar off the gold standard, though it may have been news and it was spoken of, it was not mentally programmed into the masses. You see, everything that a majority of the population knows is a part of a program. If everyone knows the same thing and is part of the same thought, then that was a program. If there's a major piece of information that the public does not know, it's normally because it was not programmed to be known or understood. Again, Richard Nixon was the public face of the advance of the world government agenda. He changed the world by changing the monetary rules for the system and changed the geopolitical world by bringing China into geopolitics and beginning the Cold War with the Soviet Union. He was the face of the international bankers' conspiratorial agenda, and when his purpose was done, they made a scandal that would bring him out of the limelight into shame, so that whenever you speak of the bad of Nixon, people already know because of the scandal, but they are never able to comprehend truly the magnitude of what really transpired. So now, as the 70s moves on, the whole agenda for their new world has been set, and the public, they didn't have a clue. Nixon, he leaves with a smile and a wave as the public face of the conspiracy doing the world dirty. Gerald Ford and Nelson Rockefeller come in office as the new face of leadership, and Gerald Ford's role is short-lived, only for the transition, while there is Rockefeller in the White House guiding the transition personally. You have to understand the reason for Ford. He was just there for the public. He is the man telling the mind-controlled public it's time to move on past Richard Nixon.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
He was just a buffer. And after he gets in office, he immediately pardons Nixon for any crime that this country would want to blame him for.
Now therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
The move wasn't fully well received, but people got over it. It wasn't just for the Watergate scandal either, but for all crimes against the United States. I mean, this is all theater, and those of you who grew up during this time, I hope that when you review this now, it's easily able to be seen. So let's talk about the problems. There was an oil crisis in 73, which then led to the recession of 1973, which started in November. But though things were bad, I'm sure that the impeachment of the president was probably more spoken of than the problems of the recession. I'm going to ask all you that was alive, did they speak more about the problems of the recession, or did they speak more about Richard Nixon being impeached? And you could assume that nothing was probably being done about it, because being that Nixon was going through the scandal and people were beginning to hate him and focus on him, they probably weren't looking for him to solve the recession. They probably were just looking for him to go. Now, I don't know this for sure because I was not alive during that time. So I'm asking many of you, what were your thoughts during this recession and Nixon being caught up in the scandal? What were you focused on? But anyways, by the time Gerald Ford came into office, it seems he was only put there to be a look of transition to move on. And again, please note that also in the White House with him was the new Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, right in the White House as the changes the government needed to go through. After this, their hidden hand would not be so easily seen in government. So let's talk about the recession. The recession was blamed on the long Vietnam War. That was the main story. They said that the country began to pay a price for the war because the tax increases had not come in order to pay for it. Basically, they didn't raise the taxes in order to pay for the war, so they needed to borrow the money. The Vietnam War was the scapegoat of the recession during Nixon. So Nixon wasn't really blamed for all of this. It was the Vietnam War, and this was just the United States government they blamed. At this period of time, at this recession, this is the period when we first had stagflation. This is when the economy begins to slow down while there is inflation. The prices of goods and services keeps going up. That's a big problem. The money's inflated, but people are losing jobs and economic activity is slowing down. In 73, inflation began to hit Americans. The salaries and their pensions were not going up, but the cost of living was increasing. Yes, this is exactly like what we're dealing with right now. The reason why the Fed started raising rates last year. And so Gerald Ford comes in as a man that was buying the system time, basically, or going to actually fix the problems. I think that's what they were looking for. When he took office, Ford declared inflation public enemy number one before Congress.
The tyranny of double-digit inflation is our common enemy in 1974. I think everybody in this wonderful audience tonight knows as well as I do that inflation is the cruelest kind of taxation without representation.
He gave a silly speech to the Congress pleading to the American public, and then they started a propaganda campaign called WIN, which actually stood for Whip Inflation Now. The program called for businesses to maintain or reduce prices and for citizens to do their part by spending less and conserving energy. I mean, it wasn't policy. He was just asking the citizens to help him by them spending less. He suggested actions for citizens, including carpooling, turning down their thermostats, and starting their own vegetable gardens. It was just a mental campaign directing the general public of how to deal with the times that they were in. They literally put out win buttons and put up win posters just as a way of promoting the propaganda. Apparently, it didn't take hold, but I don't think it was supposed to, more than just buy them more time. A couple months later, in January of 1975, they decide to own the situation. Ford gives his State of the Union address. He reports that the State of the Union is not good.
Reported as the Constitution requires on the State of the Union. When the bipartisan applause stopped, President Truman said, "I am happy to report to the 81st Congress that the State of the Union is good. Our nation is better able than ever before to meet the needs of the American people and to give them their fair chance in the pursuit of happiness. It is foremost among the nations of the world in the search for peace." Today, that freshman member from Michigan stands where Mr. Truman stood. And I must say to you that the State of the Union is not good. Millions of Americans are out of work. Recession and inflation are eroding the money of millions more. Prices are too high and sales are too slow. This year's federal deficit will be about $30 billion. Next year's probably $45 billion. The national debt will rise to over $500 billion.
And this was easy for him to say because he's not in direct blame of it. And it is at this point right here that brings us into the 1980s. This moment of theater is where the 1980s begins. This is when Ronald Reagan now comes on the scene as a candidate for president. But the times were not ready for him yet. They were just warming up. The 80s was his decade. That was the decade of great change. So they had more to do during the 70s. The struggles and failures were not fully activated yet in 1975. The next 5 years gets aggressively worse economically leading into the 1980s. They clearly were using chaos to bring in more order. And the 80s was the definite introduction to a changed world, and Reagan was the face of it. But the death of the dollar was a backdrop of the 70s, and the masses did not know they were a part of this agenda. And this is the important thing to note. All the economic pain that came was not from the scapegoats that the media told the general public was the cause. It was from the United States dollar being moved off the gold standard, and now the value of the dollar in the international economy was devalued along with every other currency. So the international bankers were establishing their new monetary system of debt and money printing, and it took a decade and a half to rein it all in. This is the story of how the United States went from being a manufacturing economy to a consumer-based economy. But we'll get to that. Just note, again, the general public was under severe mind control. They were completely unaware, and they were completely led by those put in as a face of power. They believed that these people would be the solution. These puppet masters knew that in order to bring the world into their new world that they were creating, They needed to attach them to their world economic system. Every nation needed to be a part of it. And then the plan was to destroy the main asset that controlled the whole system, which was the dollar. And as you see, like that clip from the movie I showed, they had this agenda planned well before we all knew about it today. So where are we going with all this? Well, in order to understand where the world was going in the 80s, you needed to understand the agenda of the new world, which truly took shape in the 70s, right under everyone's nose, that were distracted by political noise and scandals. These puppet masters have been engineering a collapse of our system since all of us were born. They distract us through their mind control techniques and put people in front of us that we felt we could trust. I mean, look at this man. Walter Cronkite was known as the most trusted man in America. He was picked in 1962 when the televisions really started coming in all the homes. He was picked as the anchor of the CBS Evening News, the show that still runs today. And for two of the most polarized and eventful decades, the 60s and the 70s, he was the authoritative voice of news in America. He was the man who told viewers that President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. He was the one that told everyone that man had walked on the moon and that the Vietnam War could not be won. And so this man, who the American public trusted in the beginning of the rise of television and television journalism, when he said something, people believed him. So this man, along with others, directed the thought of what we should know, believe in, and trust. And this is how we got here today. Imagine someone being the most trusted man in America, and he was the one giving the news. Oh my goodness. So if you go back to his news segments, which are hard to get actually, and review what he spoke on and said, you can know what the general public knew. The public had been carefully guided into this agenda of a new world. They had been mentally attacked and distracted. All of their leaders had been corrupt, and by the end of the 70s, these power brokers who were the puppeteers of the world, for the next stage of the agenda, they knew they no longer needed men with opinions to be the face of their policy. They needed well-groomed men and women that obeyed and knew how to follow the script. So they first turned to actors. Literally actors. But we'll get to that. Let me talk about this series real quick so you understand. I desire that your eyes are opened and your minds are made aware of the conspiracy that has been guiding your life. You have been born into this, and many of you are unaware of it. You have been mentally manipulated in order to be steered into and accept a new world that they are preparing. If you can recognize the mind control, you can then wake up to the programming and get off of their train. While all of this feels very secular, this is all deeply religious and all about our souls. You have to understand that at some point, the United States government, as well as other governments in the world, became the gods of their citizens. A long time ago, people put their faith and trust in their government in hopes that their leaders will make the world a better place and fix their issues. Think about it. What were they doing in the civil rights era? They didn't go to Yah. They went to the government and asked them to help them and fix their problems, instead of trusting in our Creator and resting on Him to fix their issues and heal their world. So the government became their God. And this is why people vote and believe they're making a difference in the polls. Heavily mind-controlled individuals tied to a system that has been oppressing them since before they were born. But they actually believe that their checking off of a box will fix the world when the world has only gone in the direction it has always been deemed to go. The purpose of getting everyone involved in the political system is not about actually giving power to the people. It's about steering the hearts and minds of the population and making them feel that they have a stake in the world that is being created. When you vote, all you are doing is checking off a box that their mind control is working. In the end, it doesn't matter who you vote for because their agenda will go through no matter what. You cannot slow it down by engaging in their system. You slow it down by relying on the power of our Creator that works through His Holy Spirit. If then you were raised with Messiah, seek those things which are above, where Messiah is, sitting at the right hand of Elohim. Set your mind on things above, not on the things on the earth. That's Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. You have to remember that. I had to go back in time and really bring back the history in order to deal with the next levels of mind control. The mind control that we have been dealing with corrupted our whole way of thought, not just with our morals like we saw with the sexual revolution, but we have been led and steered into completely abandoning our trust and dependency on Yah, and we have given it over to Satanists. we have given them our allegiance. I mean, if you think about it, in America, since we were in elementary school, we were conditioned to do this. We pledged allegiance to the flag. You need to understand that you have been mentally manipulated and steered into accepting this new world that is coming. Your thoughts have not always been your own. You have been carefully directed, and our only way out, your only way, is through Yahuwah. You must repent and come into full acceptance of Yahusha the Messiah and pledge allegiance to his kingdom, because right now it seems more than 90% of this world is pledged to Satan's kingdom, which is a false one that will be burned in fire. The reason I'm making this series is to assist those who have prayed to come closer to Yah and be ready for him. In order to do this, we need to remove the mind control. So though I can't go over everything, obviously, I hope that you can see the need to scrutinize your thoughts completely and no longer trust in the thoughts you have been conditioned to hold. These videos are not for everyone. It's for those who are preparing for Yah. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of Elohim, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to Elohim, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of Elohim. That's Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. You have to renew your mind and set it on the things above, and forget all the programming you were once held to. The agenda of this grand conspiracy has been set and put into planning many decades ago. We are just being carefully steered into it, and if you can go back and review the history of this, you could probably see clearer how this was able to occur. You can see who we as a people gave our minds and trust over to, and how this decision has negatively affected our souls. It gets even worse as time continues. That's why I want to get to the 80s. But if you do not see the agenda that was put forth all these decades before, as we continue,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
You may miss the answer to your question of why. In the end, I know that this message will be hard for many to receive, especially since people have been conditioned all their life to believe in the power of their vote and to trust the news and the government. I know there is a lot of programming that was promoted to you that you have to break free from. It's really up to you to make your decision on what you believe and who you will serve. Take it up in prayer and submit to Yah's voice. Whatever you do, please make sure you know what you're doing. In these last days, it's important to me to keep my sanity and my mind and my heart purely for our Father, and that's what I will continue to do. I hope that you will do it along with me. But just as Joshua said to the Israelites, I will say back to you, but I am just changing one word to fit with today. If it seems evil to you to serve Yahuwah, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Americans in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahuwah. Flee from idolatry, people, and rebellion, and choose to serve Yahuwah, the Most High. Be blessed. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Okay, thanks again for watching. If this has blessed you, please don't forget to like this and share this video with others. I pray this wakes up many. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this channel. Yah willing, I upload every Friday. Don't forget to follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram, as well as on my website, truthunedited.com. If you no longer see this channel on this platform, please look for my videos on my website. I can communicate through you on the website. Thank you for watching. I'm thankful for all of you. Thank you especially to those Yah has placed it on your hearts to give, and you have done so. I thank you for your assistance in carrying out this ministry every week. Thank you for your blessings and your prayers. They truly support this ministry. Thank you for your obedience to Yah's call on your heart. Okay, thanks again for watching, everyone. I love you all.